at the bottom, there
Perfect, perfect. But yeah, no, it was, I was made a co-host. I didn't realize I have such a big honor. Okay, fantastic. And
we're recording from now on your presentation.
Yeah. Okay, so can you see the slides?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Wonderful. Okay, so without much ado, in fact, it's a good introduction how I want to start my talk, namely with my journeys to India, because one thing, I mean, I think there are a lot of positive things I have discovered this year, but one such thing is that I couldn't do much traveling, and certainly not the one to India. And I would say there are two big pleasures, apart from the fact of going to a lovely place, that I find traveling itself. One is reading books. And in fact, on my trips to India, I usually read Indian philosophy by Radhakrishnan. It was the favorite book of my father, but he told me, my son, don't start reading it until you are 40, you will not understand anything. So I started with 40. I am now in the middle of the second of the two volumes. But the second thing, which I think is lovely, is to look out of the window. And usually, if you fly via Dubai or Abu Dhabi or Doha, then the flight passes across the Eastern Anatolia, Northern Iraq, Zagros Mountains, landscape which in a way is part of the Fertile Crescent, which is the cradle of agriculture, cities, and script. So in a way, I think I could do the whole talk based on the origin of the Akkadic script. And one of the fascinating things is you see two rivers which start incredibly close. So here you see Tigris and Euphrates, which basically define the land between the two rivers, Mesopotamia. And they are very, very close in the beginning when they start, when they are very small. Then they go apart. And then at the very, very end, near Basra, they come together in Shat al-Arab into Persian Gulf. So in a way, you have this kind of almost joint beginning, going apart, coming back together. And this metaphor came into my mind when I was speaking with, here, the picture below, Colin Flynn from Dublin City University. Conversations with him are always fascinating, and I learned a lot from him. And one day, he kind of told me about the paper here on the left, Motivational Variables in Second Language Acquisition, which many people consider as the beginning of kind of systematic work on motivation in second language learning. And if you remember the talk of yesterday about the importance of identity and so on in language learning, well, 61 years ago, Gardner and Lambert formulated it very, very clearly. So here you see below, the significant positive correlation between the orientation index and achievement in French indicates that the integratively oriented students are generally more successful in acquiring French than those who are instrumentally oriented. So apart from the fact that it's much more fun to learn something when you really identify with it, it's also much more effective. A fantastic insight, as I say, 61 years ago in 59. But then I immediately ask, oh, Wallace Lambert, this name sounds very familiar to me, because in 1962, he wrote the paper with, this time with Elizabeth Peal, another of the PhD students of his, the relation of bilingualism to intelligence. And that was the first study which started questioning what until then was the general belief that multilingualism is something very bad for mind and intelligence. I will come to it later in this lecture. So you have this the same person, Wallace Lambert, making a major contribution to the kind of questions of identity questions, which are certainly close to what, let's say, sociolinguistics nowadays would consider as their territory, but at the same time, very close to what now would be cognitive psychology of language, and that includes for me both the psycholinguistics and the neurolinguistics. So that's the common origin. Now, interestingly, you certainly recognize these two groups. The first paper was published 1 year before Beatles were formed, and the second paper exactly in the year when Rolling Stones were formed. So just to give you some kind of temporal framework. And I would say that 1960s were revolutionary, not only in terms of rock music. I mean, unfortunately, I am too young to really have got anything of this time, but I mean, from what I have read and heard, I would say in science, and particularly in cognitive science, sense. It was the time where the kind of iron grip of behaviorism started to loosen. And that's why I call it here a post-behaviorist interglacial period in which new ideas started proliferating. A very influential one, to which I will come in a moment, is generativism, the generative grammar of Noam Chomsky. I mean, starting in late 50s, but then very, very important. I will cite in next slide from it, 1965. However, it has, of course, the kind of this formal approach to grammar, has much longer roots. And that includes, in fact, probably the first systematic linguistic system in the world, formulated by Panini in India in 5th century BC. Another development, which is fascinating, I find, is that of cognitive psychology. And the person who I find particularly fascinating in this respect is Ulrich Neisser, who in fact was trying in some way to reconcile, as difficult as it seems for us to imagine now, psychoanalysis and computing, because that was the time where the first computers started becoming a model also how brain might function. And then you have also sociolinguistics. I mean, although the term is older, again, interestingly, coined by T.C. Hudson in connection with Indian census in 39, I think most psycholinguists would agree that the kind of real milestones were the studies by William Labov in 63 and 66, first on Martha Vineyard's Island in Massachusetts, and then on Upper East Side in New York. And here I have a link. I mean, I presume many of you will know the Abralim lecture series, so the series of Associação Brasileira de Linguística. And you can hear both Chomsky and Labov giving talks this year. Unfortunately, Neisser is no longer with us, so we cannot listen to him. So that was, so to say, the kind of the revolutionary time of the 60s. But remember that many revolutions carry in them also the seed of dogmatism and rigidity. So let us now start with the first point with Chomsky. Now, this is a citation which, of course, all linguists will know, but maybe not many people coming from psychology, where he says, linguistic theory is concerned primarily with an ideal speaker-listener in a completely homogeneous speech community who knows its language perfectly and is unaffected by such grammatically irrelevant conditions as memory limitations, distractions, shifts of attention and interest, and errors in applying his knowledge of this language in actual performance. So very clearly, this, I would say, what practically neurosocial linguists, but I would say what many cognitive linguists would consider as most interesting and relevant is here outside what is the interest of the generative grammar. Let me now compare it a little bit to alcohol. So let's imagine how would sociolinguists and generativists approach studying alcohol. Now, I could imagine here, and any sociolinguist, please criticize me if you think I'm not correct, that let's say coming from Poland, I would compare wódka luksusowa and żytnia. Luksusowa coming, in fact, from potatoes, which originally were the posh one. Potatoes were expensive. They were only in the royal fields. And then the wheat one, the rye one from cereals was the cheap one. Then potatoes became cheap and potato vodka became cheap again. And now, as I say, there is a reappreciation of potato vodka with luksusowa, that's what we call luxurious. You could do similar things, for instance, with whiskey in the place where I am now, in Scotland, where you have West and East Coast whiskey, also with different context and so on. And, of course, to pay homage to the country which hosts this meeting, Spain, here we have a nice bottle of Albarino from Galicia, which I'm sure Annick will know about, and here Gran Duque d'Alba. I have here because a friend of mine from Galicia said when his uncle was told by his doctor he drinks too much alcohol, he said, "Yo no bevo alcohol, solo Gran Duque d'Alba." I drink no alcohol, only the Grand Duke of Alba. So that would be, I would say, a sociolinguistic approach to alcohol. What is the generativist one? Well, it's very simple, C2H5OH. That's the formulation, and that's what you have everywhere. So in one case, you are interested in variation. In the other, you are interested in the kind of common denominator. Now, I'm hasten to add, it's not that one approach is right and the other is wrong. There's no question that this formula for alcohol is a correct one. And in fact, you can measure the levels in every of the bottles shown above. But there is also some information beyond that, and whether you consider it relevant or not is the question. So here we have this kind of two approaches. Now, by the time where I started consciously to enter this field in the 80s, I would say, because possibly of this separation of the ideal speaker, pure language, and all the context, the two rivers were probably as far apart as you could imagine. Brain was seen in a very modular way as a chest of drawers. The crucial author in this time was Jerry Fodor in 1983 and his book, The Modularity of Mind. And he basically was describing different modules informationally encapsulated. And then we have to admit there was also a non-modular kind of center, cognitive cloud in some of them. And later this became a few years later central executive. Now, I don't want to speak much in this talk about central executive because just last week I gave a full Edinburgh Neuroscience Christmas lecture on the topic of central executive, and it is available under this connection, so you can listen to it. It's a very, very fascinating story, but a different one. However, what is important about these modular models is they are deterministic, static, and with limited resources. So here I have to pay homage now to my daughter, who, once we arrived to a conference last year in a hotel, was putting lovely, as you can see, all the things in the chest of drawers. And that gave me the kind of metaphor that in a way brain in this model was seen as a kind of chest of drawers where you simply put things into the kind of correct places. But that also means limited resources, because if you put some of your pajamas, there is no space for trousers. And if you put trousers, there is no space for t-shirts. So this was a very neat model and led to what today morning, in fact, Apurva Poranik, one of my colleagues and friends, very much kind of nicely described as these box and arrows models, where you had these different parts. So, and I have again to say, it was a very productive approach in that it identified a lot of so-called double dissociations. So these ideas led, I would say, to a much better understanding of the mind than we had before. However, they did have some slight problems. One of them, it was difficult in these models to explain change, including, for instance, the recovery after aphasia, recovery after any brain damage. And in fact, this modularity was questioned by compensation theories, which said that the brain always has to be seen as a network where different parts compensate each other. The second thing which didn't fit very nicely was multilingualism, as I will be showing in a moment. Now, over the last 40 years or 25, 30 years, I would say I have seen an incredible and fascinating millennial paradigm shift. Now, to start with, again, we should not pretend that the history started in the year 2000. The idea of importance of connections and disconnections is a very old one and goes back at least into 19th century and the famous Wernicke-Lichtheim models of language in aphasia and so on. And today morning, Apurva Poranik very nicely mentioned Norman Geschwind, who was in fact one of the crucial figures in American aphasiology in late 20th century and also a connoisseur of the history. However, it is probably fair to say that we had radical changes in our environment around the year 2000. Firstly, the emergence of internet, which allows us to communicate as we do now, which would not have been possible in the time when I was PhD student at Freiburg in Breisgau in Germany. And also the computers themselves became cleverer in that they started to be able to learn. So the early computers, you had to predetermine everything, whereas nowadays everybody would be speaking about machine learning. So in parallel, in our understanding of the brain, we have shifted from thinking in terms of centers and areas, which was also very popular in the early stages of neuroimaging, to networks. Nowadays, you see network everywhere. They are obviously interconnected and interactive with emergent structures, which help to see lifelong neuroplasticity as allowing adaptation to environment across the lifespan, and in fact also adaptation to disease. So how does it translate into the view we see mono multilingualism? Well, if we have the kind of the more old-fashioned model of the 80s, the modular one, then, as I say, it's limited resources. So there is a competition for space between languages. So here comes the idea that many people have that, if you learn a second language, it somehow pushes the first out, like, socks would push out the t-shirts of your chest of drawers. And if you learn too many languages, then you don't have space for any other thing. Now, if you laugh about it, I have, in fact, nice citations I can give. I mean, I took it out because of time, but people who seriously said, well, for instance, in England, we are very fortunate that we don't have to learn foreign languages, and that's why we have more space to learn math and literature and so on. I don't think it really works like this, I'm afraid. In interactive valued models, and the problem of these models is the limited resources, is that they don't take into account interaction. Every single thing is perceived as individual, and indeed a sock is not necessarily kind of becoming better by being next to a t-shirt. However, the way we learn is by connecting things. We don't learn things in isolation. We learn things always connected. And interaction offers more than the sum of ingredients. So in these interactive network models, different languages support each other. You learn a new term in a new language, and that automatically reinforces your knowledge in other languages. And the practice of multilingualism modulates executive functions. The practice, that's very, very important, because this is a crucial shift from the Chomsky generative models that were always very interested in competence, which was acquired within the first few years of life, the famous term, critical period, whereas the new models stress not so much competence or proficiency, but in fact practice and use. This is crucially important, and that's some of the ideas which Dina Mehmedbegov and myself put in a paper about kind of models and implicit assumptions in multilingualism in European Journal of Language Policy. So that brings now sociolinguistic on stage, because if what counts is not just this abstract competence, but the practice, and more than that, your lifelong practice, then of course all the big questions of sociolinguistic are becoming at the same time the big issues of cognition. So here is a selection, I mean, on my desk here where I am, here's a selection. So you see the Indian flag again, I think, here, and Ashoka's pillar. Now here's 3 textbooks of sociolinguistic. I always like to read more than one book. As Giacomo Casanova once said nicely, never believe a man who read only one book. But if you look, of course, there will be difference, but I think most and central notions across all the 3 books that I could find in sociolinguistic was variation, very crucial term, and then variation in context, not variation just, so to say, in abstract way. The importance of time and place, the importance of attitudes and ideologies, the importance of practices of language use, and the importance of things like education, status, ethnicity, and gender. So preparing for this talk, I realized that in fact, I have been a sociolinguist most of my life. I just didn't realize that. Because here on the right are 2 papers I published in 2016 in Linguistic Approaches to Bilingualism, which are very much exactly about all the variables that we are mentioning on the left. And here, and that's a very, very important point, I really want to stress it. I think the importance is that the sociolinguistic variables influence 2 things, and both are very important. Firstly, they influence the performance on cognitive tests, because if it is the practice of language which decides how our executive functions, for instance, adapt to it, then the practice is important. But also, I would go to one step further. I would say that sociolinguistic variables also influence the design, analysis, and interpretation of research. Now, to kind of show it, let me give you in the next few minutes a short history of the world of the last, let's say, 5,000 to 10,000 years. So the first thing is, that is the paper I was mentioning with Dina, where we wrote about implicit assumptions. We have a very strong kind of implicit assumption that monolingualism is somehow the default, the normal state, that humanity was monolingual and then the languages started to diverge. And in fact, we find it very clearly in the Bible. And the whole earth was of one language and one speech. However, they are also multilingual creation myths. For instance, in Northern Australia, there is an idea of Warramarungunji, a goddess, ancestral goddess of many tribes who came from Indonesia, and then was giving people their distinct land, food, and language. I have to say, I quite love the combination of land, food, and language as three factors defining us. And that means, and here is something which we published in fact quite a while ago with Suvarna Ladi, where we said bilingualism is very common worldwide. It might have been the original state of human communities, and our brains are extremely well suited to support it. And in fact, it's not just our idea. I mean, one of the most important and prominent field linguists in Australia, or I mean, well, beyond Australia, Nick Evans, basically says the same on his experience with hunter-gatherer societies. Because most hunter-gatherer societies are not only multilingual, they are highly multilingual, with a phenomenon of linguistic exogamy, namely, so that people are, it is taboo to marry someone speaking the same language. Now, if you find this strange, I want to draw your attention that the European Union has, well, it's impossible to speak of the European Union without a touch of nostalgia if you happen to be in the UK, that European Union have a special program to support linguistic exogamy. It is called Erasmus. Namely, one of the biggest effects of Erasmus is that students are much more likely to marry someone coming from a different country and therefore speaking a different language. However, that means that across the world, it is usual for these societies, which are probably much closer to how human societies were when language first developed. Children grow up with different languages, and you are supposed to learn new languages across lifetime. So there is nothing more natural than new languages, although the exact rules vary across different societies. So here I have as examples Amazon in Colombia and Brazil. Here, my group, these were the guides which took me up Kilimanjaro 2015, and I don't think any of those spoke less than 3 languages. Most of them spoke 4 or 5. And here, a nice example from Suvarna from India, a shopping list in different languages. And here is Nick Evans with a group of people in Papua New Guinea. So from this point of view, multilingual is normal, as I say in one of my so to say, standard hashtags on Twitter. However, across the history, you have 2 narratives of languages, of multilingualism. One is a negative one, the idea that is divisive for society. The term intergenerational schizophrenia was used very recently, about 10 years ago or so, 15, by David Blunkett, at that time Labour Home Secretary, who was shocked to hear that a lot of families in Britain speak South Asian languages at home, and was almost associating it with the danger of terrorism. So if you speak Urdu at home, you are probably a potential terrorist. And then, so the idea is divisive for society and confusing for individuals. And this is not just a kind of Western idea. I mean, unfortunately, James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England, would be a good example of that, with his first step, so to say, to eradicate Scottish Gaelic with Statues of Iona in early 17th century. But also Incas, for instance, like to centralize linguistically the empire, having the whole empire speaking Quechua. But there are also other examples. Multilingualism can be perceived as enriching for society in context of multiculturalism, liberalism, and so on, and beneficial for individual, personally, professionally, socially. And here you have Persepolis. Persian Empire was incredibly multilingual. In fact, the Persian elite did not impose their own language. They used not Farsi, the Old Persian. They used, in fact, the Aramaic, the most widely spoken language, as the language of administration. And here you have Mithridates, who was a king of Pontius, who was very proud to say that he speaks fluently more than 20 languages spoken by his subjects, so that he can speak fluently with each of them in their own language. Now, this is a very, very important paper of the, I would say, the kind of negative tradition, and important because you see both levels to which I was referring, the level of individual performance, sociolinguistic, and the level of interpretation of the data. This comes from Sir from Wales, a study published in British Journal of Psychology in 1923, the effects of bilingualism on intelligence, in which Sir says, well, the bilinguals have a lack of definiteness in meaning, confusion which is carried over from the brain area connected with language to those connected with other functions. Now, I find it very interesting because here the metaphor of the brain is used, but without any neural evidence. It was just that for people at that time, it was impossible to think of brain other than in terms of the chest of drawers. So, as I say, there is no, I mean, Sir was an educationalist, didn't understand much about neurology. It is simply self-evident that there cannot be enough space in brain for two languages. And then, in fact, he makes even a kind of psychoanalytic emotional argument. However, what we would say now looking at this study is that he didn't pay much attention to sociolinguistic variables, namely his Welsh children came from what we would call now lower socioeconomic status background than those speaking English more. And from this point of view, you were probably measuring here, I mean, he was measuring here effects of education of a group which was disadvantaged in their own country, as the Welsh speakers and Scottish Gaelic speakers have been for centuries until very, very recently. Unfortunately, this error persists until today. So, for instance, one of the most prolific authors who kind of always questions any differences, genuine differences, like alone advantages in cognitive function bilingualism, usually does it, Kenneth Papp, does it in San Francisco, in a university where most of his bilinguals come from socially disadvantaged groups as compared to socially advantaged monolinguals. So from this point of view, it is an old error, but I'm afraid it is still persistent. But here we see the other level, the level of the interpretation. Sir writes, the use of the native language in the subject states tends to weaken in favor of the language of the governing state. Yet a people will not readily abandon their language and adopt another. Under British rule, there are many people who speak other tongues, and consciously or unconsciously, the English language is coming gradually to prevail in the subject states of Britain. The natives during this process passing through various stages of bilingualism. So here we can see that he perceives bilingualism simply as a transitory period between the kind of lowest stage of human development, where people speak a language other than English, and the highest level of social development in which people speak English only. That was the assumption on which the whole literature has been built, and as I will show in a moment, is still in many places in the world. Now, I mentioned to you, I mentioned the kind of the two rivers coming together, this impressive Lambert and Peal study, 1962, the year of the Rolling Stones. Now, also this didn't happen in a social vacuum. It happened in Quebec in the time of so-called La Révolution Tranquille, the Tranquil Revolution, where basically the Quebecois were trying to reassert their language rights. So the slogan you can see here was Maintenant jamais, now or never, maître chez nous. We want to be masters in our own house. And the study looked at 10 years old, and the question was, is it true that monolinguals are so much better than bilinguals? So the assumption was the bilinguals must be bad, but maybe not quite as bad. And what came out was exactly the opposite, if anything. If you match them, sociolinguistics coming in again, for socioeconomic and educational status, they were in fact better than the monolinguals. So this was, we know now, a seminal study, but it took quite a while until it spread. And I would say until today, Canada remains one of the leading countries in this respect. I mean, he is one of the most prolific authors in this field, Ellen Białystok, and based at York University in Toronto. And what she showed was originally in children, later also in older people and in dementia. But as I say, it's not a topic, so to say, of this talk now. I would be happy to speak about it in discussion and so on. But what she showed was that bilingual children have better metalinguistic skills and knowledge, which makes it easier for them to learn other languages. They are better in social cognition, also recognizing the theory of mind, other people's perspective, and they tend to outperform the others on special executive functions, not all of them, but those that have to do with switching, monitoring, and I mean, in particular. So that was the situation, so to say, as you see, changed dramatically over the 2000s. But, you know, when you have change, you also have exaggeration. So one is, it is not necessarily so that bilingualism or multilingualism leads to a society being harmonious and people loving each other. It would be nice, it's not the case. Although bilingualism can postpone the onset of dementia, it doesn't prevent it. So it's not quite the, here on the right side, what you see is not quite the fountain of youth. Bilingualism can often be used in political context. So here, some of you might not recognize this flag. It's the flag of Friesland. And I found it when I was looking after a study which I did with Sovarna about stroke and bilingualism, where here the argument was that bilingual Frisians are better equipped, so to say, to fight against stroke because they have two languages. And this is a wonderful claim. That people who are bilingual are smart, creative, and better lovers. But so far, I'm not aware of any double-blind controlled study that would really show it. If you come across any, please let me know. I'm not saying it's impossible. Remember, social cognition could be part of being a good lover, but we don't know. So you can have this kind of very positive idealization, seeing bilingualism as, you know, something which is wonderful for everybody and so on. You can have exactly the opposite, bilingualism being seen as something very negative. So if you look at the three politicians, which 4 years ago were vying for the Republican candidacy in America, you will find that two of them are real patriots, and one of them was an obvious traitor. And the traitor, I mean, very well hidden, or the other American flags behind, was obviously Jeb Bush, who was accused both by Trump and by Sarah Palin that he can speak Spanish. So the ability of speaking Spanish was already something that made you suspicious. How can you trust someone who speaks two languages? It's a little bit like adultery, isn't it? He must have also two wives. So around the, let's say, 2015, there was a lot what was called kind of bilingualism debate. So in August, Ellen Białystok had a debate with Manolo Carreras in London at the Neurobiology of Language. In Ghent, here in September 2016, I had a debate with Ken Papp. And then in Akaslompolo, following year, I had a debate with Manolo Carreras. And the idea was, is there an effect or not, and so on and so on. Now, some people still continue working in this idea that there must be either a bilingual advantage or no bilingual advantage. But for me, it's a little bit almost like a kind of football game. They are kind of two teams. It has a certain entertainment value, but I don't think it's a way which brings us forward in science. What can bring us forward is for these two rivers to come together again. So what we started to see over the last 5 years is that more and more studies are not just looking at the comparison between bilingual and monolingual, but are looking at different linguistic environment. Here you have a title of a lovely paper, Redefining Bilingualism as a Spectrum of Experiences that differentially affects brain structure and brain function. And below that is a study where which we did comparing Singapore and Edinburgh, where we wrote that basically from bilingualism to bilingualisms, that we should use the term in plural. So now suddenly social environment became important, conventions, prestige and ideology, and individual choice, identity, value judgments, language as mental exercise. So suddenly all these experience variables and practice variables are important also for cognition. And this is something you can see in theoretical models, even developed by the same person. So here's David Green, one of the I would say, probably deepest theoreticians in this field. And in his 98 model, you can see, I think it was a great model at that time, but I mean, it still bears, so to say, resemblance to this kind of box and arrows we were speaking previously. And with, by the way, SAS, which is the supervisory attentional system, that was the Tim Shally's version from what, let's say, Alan Badley called central executive. And then below, here is the adaptive control hypothesis, which he developed with Jubin Abutalebi, with further refinement with his studies with Li Wei, where he looks at basically not only at a much more fine-grained neuroscientific model and brain anatomy, functional anatomy, but also much more fine-grained interaction with the environment. So now suddenly it is important how people code switch and so on and so on. So you have an increasing role of linguistic environment, which is exactly the topic of sociolinguistics. So just to give you some examples of relevant variables, well, the age of acquisition was already important in the kind of Chomskyan times, because obviously that's the kind of critical period. But now we have, for instance, here a study by Bice and Kroll suggesting that monolinguals growing up in linguistically diverse contexts might have an edge in terms of the brain response to new sounds. There were two groups which were confronted with Finnish vowel harmony without having any previous knowledge of Finnish, or in fact of any other of the languages which have similar vowel harmony. So age of acquisition proficiency are still important, and I would say are defined even more finer. But now patterns of language use across the whole lifespan are important. I had a series of studies where with Angela de Bruin and Sergio de la Sala, where we looked at people in Western Isles of Scotland, and there you find that all people who are now over 65 were bilingual when they were basically children, because the whole community spoke Gaelic, but the environment, school, was only English speaking. You would have been beaten if you were caught speaking Gaelic at school. Then during working life, most of them have to speak English, but then after retirement, you have now suddenly a big change. Some people continue speaking English only. Some people come back to speak more and more Gaelic. So in fact, big changes in practice of language happen all the lifetime, even after retirement. Another important thing, social context and code switching. So if we speak about multilingualism, it could make difference, and that's something which we make in this paper about bilingualism to bilingualism, Singapore and Edinburgh. Let's say in Edinburgh, you can be bilingual and switch languages only twice. So let's say at home, I can speak Polish or Spanish. Then I go to work where I speak only English. I come back home, I leave my jacket, in the door and my English on the door and speak only Polish or Spanish again. If you are in Singapore, you will probably, like in India, for instance, mix the languages all the time. So that could have a huge difference on the way how executive functions are dealing and monitoring it. So now, before I come to conclusions, I want to add one more point, and which I find very, very important in this context, and that is the question of linguistic diversity. By far, most studies that I was mentioning so far have been done on people speaking English. Very often monolingual English speakers or English plus some other languages. Very often immigrants to English-speaking countries. Now, together with Madeleine Beveridge, we are looking at language diversity in aphasia research. It's already almost 10 years ago, so time for a new study like this. We are looking in 3 main journals, including aphasiology, and the study was published in aphasiology. Not surprisingly, we found that English was the main language in 60%, over 60%. German was the second one with 7%, and that is the language spoken by the patients, not the language spoken, of the paper. All papers were in English, but that was the language of the patients. Dutch, quite high up, not a very frequent language, but a lot of aphasiological research there. French, Spanish, 2.8, Chinese, that's the highest non-Indo-European language, 2.5%, Greek and Hebrew just above 1, and then we are under 1%. So you can see it's a very, very tilted picture. However, what is much more important than these numbers are the ones that are coming now. Because Madeleine had a fantastic idea. She said, well, that's just about the papers, but let's look how influential they are. And then she was looking at papers which were cited 30 to 50 times. Out of these 21 papers, 15 were on English-speaking patients, 3 on Italian. If we went to papers with more than 50 citations, all of them were on English-speaking patients. So that means that all our theories are developed on the basis of English, and then sometimes looking, oh, let's look how it works in this and this language. So it means all the phenomena that happen not to exist in English are not part of our models. We don't have grammatical gender. I was so excited that we have so many papers on grammatical gender. I think it's a crucially important area in many, many languages, but it doesn't happen to play a role in English, so therefore it's treated like an orphan. Or in fact, lexical tone. I mean, it's not just Chinese. A lot of American Indian languages have it. Of course, a lot of African languages have it, Southeast Asia, but because it's not a feature of English, it doesn't feature. So we have basically the whole theory building based on English. And it's even worse when we look at aphasia treatment. 85% of papers on treatment of aphasia are based on English speaking patients, and over 90 on 3 close related languages, English, German, and Dutch. So that means across the world, patients are being treated as if they were monolingual English speakers, whatever language they speak. And again, I would be happy to go into detail in discussion on that. There are very clear reasons why, for instance, the order of reacquisition of grammatical structures needs to be language dependent, because different categories pose different levels of difficulty in different languages. And people like Luria have recognized that, long time ago. And by the way, the picture here shows that the difference is even more pronounced if we look at non-fluent progressive aphasia and semantic dementia. So the types of aphasia which are neurodegenerative connected with dementia, here there's hardly anything on non-Indo-European languages. So we need diversity. So let me go back to the metaphor which I had before about alcohol. So not only do we need a little bit more than just say it's C2H5OH, not only do we need a little bit more than having, let's say, a comparison of potato and rye vodka. We need representativity. We need a lot of variety. So here you can see, drinks from different continents, different types of, because what we find often, if we just have an unrepresentative group, we have something I would call binge testing. It's like getting drunk on a lot of bottles of the same beer, wine, or vodka, rather than having representative sampling, which allows us to see what is the variation in human population. And that is something which, again, has been expressed many times. So with Suvarna Alladi, we wrote this paper in Cortex a while ago with the title which, says it all, why we need to move beyond the Western world. And that is the reason, for instance, I'm so thrilled to see so many presentations from India at this Congress. And I hope that with time we'll have real representativity of languages and not everything connected with English. So let me come to kind of to the end, to my conclusions. In terms of future directions, there are always opportunities and dangers. I think we should avoid a kind of methodological carpet bombing with what I would call technomyopia and fetishism, with the idea that we can neglect all social variables and social linguistic variables if only we have a large enough group or a high enough Tesla MRI scan. We should be wary of asymmetrical globalization, in which results from one part of the world are very prematurely interpreted as universal. I would say, for me, the default should be things vary, and universalism is something that we need to show, to demonstrate, rather than to assume. And I think we should be careful not to fall into dogmatism. So that means no single person, no single method, and no single study can answer all the questions. Where there is a language, there is an ideology. We should be very careful of implicit assumptions, because they influence our participants, but they also influence us as scientists. And that means that a sociolinguistic perspective is not a luxury. It is a necessary requirement in all future studies. And finally, a little bit of humbleness. healthy doubt is much better than false confidence. As the beautiful Sanskrit shloka goes, vidya dadati vinayam. So, oh, it just turned, pooh, what happened here? I just see when I was preparing the slides, the Sanskrit got turned. I will try to sort it out before I come back. I don't know. Sometimes, things when you transfer it. So it should be vidya dadati vinayam. Okay, so now I want to finish with 3 current studies where, in fact, you could help us a little bit with it. One is on language and memory. So unfortunately, we don't have versions yet in Indian languages, although they will come. I have someone working on Tamil now, but we have, for instance, Spanish and English. And so this is the question, to what extent people remember things in a particular language. The second is about language learning, and I think most of you have this experience. There is a special version both for teachers and for learners. And languages in later life, where we are interested, if you observed, for instance, in your family, your friends, or your patients, if you are clinically and so on, that, for instance, they turn back to the first language of their childhood. I mean, there are a lot of anecdotal stories of people returning to their first language when they get older or when they get demented, but there are very, very few systematic studies. So these are, so to say, the 3 things, and I can put them also in chat. And last not least, I always like to mention my tweet, because, I was informing you through tweet that I will be late. I think it is a very, very useful way of communicating. And the great thing of tweet compared to Instagram and so on is that we can put links. So I can put links to papers, to blogs, to conferences, and so on and so on. So that's my Twitter address. And sorry, so in fact, I mean, taking into account that we started a bit late because of this story, I didn't even went over time. So I hope we can still have some time for some questions. And thank you very much for your attention and for the patience you had with the small delay.
Thank you very much, Thomas, for your time and a fantastic presentation. And we have a lot to learn. And it's really good to see that how you have created bridges between all these different and connected genres. I think we already have some interested persons. I think Professor Prashannangshu is there in the very beginning, so he would start.
Thank you very much. And Thomas, I would like to have the honor of commenting upon your paper first. And you can imagine that I am going to praise it because we think alike. That was wonderful. And you have busted some myths already, from the colonial myth of limitation of intelligence to the myth of inverted commas. It is not fully busted in my mind. The myth of multilingualism being better cognitively. And the concept you said, Vidya Dadati Vinayam, maybe I can add another for you. You said something that not a single approach is good, many approaches are there. So there is another Indian word, an Indian concept, an Indian philosophy, which is called an ekant. So that is what you mentioned. There are many truths, all simultaneously true. It is not just one truth. I can.
Wonderful. Please send me the link. I will include it in my next presentation.
Yes, yes. I will give you the spellings and share it perhaps in the messages. And before you just said that multilingualism is not necessarily better, but there are certain studies, I think you are a neurologist, you can tell better, that people are saying if you know more languages, then dementias, maybe the chances of dementias, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's may be reduced. Is it true? And if it is so, then what could be the reason? Of course, there are some guesses.
Yeah.
And my question is to Dr. Apurva Pauranik also. I see he is also joined.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for the question. I think the important difference is here delaying the onset versus preventing. So unfortunately, it's not that, speaking many languages will mean that you will never get dementia, but you will get it later. And I would say, if you think that the difference is, I mean, the first studies by Bilinguistics 2007 from Toronto were showing 4 years. Our study from Hyderabad was showing, in fact, 4 years, but in case of illiterate people, interestingly, 6 years. I mean, in India, you have people who are illiterate and yet speak many languages, so you can really make the comparison. And then we were looking, for instance, in certain types of dementia, frontotemporal dementia, where it went up to about 6 years. So I would say that's quite a good deal. I mean, I would say 4 to 6 years is a lot, but as I say, it's not that it will never come. And in fact, it can come so to say, crashing down. Now, the point is, I mean, the concept very often developed in this concept. Yeah, hello. The concept is cognitive reserve. The idea that simply having a brain which is better connected allows you to compensate for longer time for pathology. So let's say if you imagine, let's say a financial crisis, and you have, let's say, some people who have very little and some people who have a lot, and then all of them lose, 50%. If you have very little, then, you are really, you lost, you don't have much reserve. If you have a lot, maybe with the 50 that are left, you can still live okay. So from this point of view, the idea is of this kind of cognitive reserve. And it is, I mean, there are studies now from 3 continents, from North America, from Europe, Baumann study from Belgium, and several studies from India. So I would say this is relatively well documented. There are some studies which don't show an effect, but again, that would be another talk. Very often the problem is they only select for the older patients, so you don't get the patients who present early, like frontotemporal dementia.
Thank you, Thomas. I think there is a quick question from Sonal Chitnis down there.
Yes. Okay, I see. As I remember, what wires fires together, how applicable is cerebral reorganization, late new language learning, regression, musical skills, and so on. Cognitive, yeah. Okay, so this is kind of several questions in one, which is lovely. So one is, I mean, thank you for citing this paper, what wires together fire, I mean, what fires together dies together. I mean, this is an idea, many of you know probably the kind of saying by Donald Hebb, that what wires together, what fires together wires together, so that you get connections, functional links produce connections. And with Siddhartha and Chanan, we develop a certain kind of idea going beyond that neurodegeneration, the degeneration is moving along the functional connection. So what wires together dies together. So you have, so to say, let's say, the cognitive aspects of the motor aspect of cognition will be also part of the degeneration in motor neuron disease and so on. Now, from this point of view, I think the question here with reorganization is, we always have to look, so to say, which parts of the brain are still preserved to reorganize. And that is something which I am absolutely passionate about, because I think for me, every cognitive assessment has 2 parts: to look what is impaired and to look what is preserved. And very often the second part is being neglected. It is as important as the first one, because what is impaired will tell you what the patients have problems with, and that's important to know. But what is preserved will tell you what you can build on. And therefore, for instance, what we found with Suvarna Alladi was that patients who have, for instance, progressive aphasia, you don't really have much delay there, because if the degenerative processes affect the language, so to say, relevant parts of the brain primarily, then they cannot compensate. So from this point of view, I think there is a lot of compensation going on at any age, including people who are older, but we have to know which parts of the network or which networks are still preserved, because they are those that can compensate. And that could also explain another very important finding from the so-called non-studies, and I mean many others, showing that, for instance, mild double pathology is more problematic than a moderate one disease. So if you have a patient who has at the same time mild Alzheimer's plus mild vascular pathology, that will be more devastating than, let's say, moderate only vascular, only Alzheimer, because in this case, the potential compensating parts of the brain are also knocked out. So that's about and then music. I would say music is as close as you can get to language for many reasons, namely, and I don't think, crosswords, can be enough and so on. What music has is a lot of different dimensions. It has the perceptual dimension. It has dimension of production, if you sing or play an instrument and so on. It has something very mathematical and exact, algorithmic, and something extremely emotional at the same time. And very often music is also part of a social activity. So from this point of view, I would expect music and language to have very, very similar effects.
Well, thank you very much, Thomas. It's such an interesting discussion. I really feel bad to stop it here, but I was just wondering if it is okay with everyone. Then maybe we can continue it afterwards during the other talks and through the chats and all that. I hope that we will be having you for
Sure. Well, yes. I mean, I might have a cup of tea or so to relax a little bit, but I mean, so if you have any questions, please, write it, and I will put, some of the links and so on into the chat. And as I say, I will be also putting them into the Twitter. So from this point of view, as I say, I use Twitter a lot, and that's a very, very good way of communicating, I find.
Thank you very much. Just a quick
Yes.
information was like, since you know that my research was very much linked with linguistic healthy diet and other stuff most related to the community languages in the UK. One of the things that I have been using, which maybe for the ideological section could be very useful maybe, is Ricardo Ruiz's model, language as a problem, as a right, as a resource. That could be the whole bilingualism aspect is very much involved in it, as you have mentioned in the past part of the presentation. Just a wee comment.
Yeah, no, I mean, can I just say, because I think it's very, very important and often forgotten. Of course, there is an extra effort in having more languages, but it's a positive effort. It's like it is an extra effort to walk up to a building rather than take a lift, or to walk to work rather than take a car, but it is a healthy effort. So I think we also have to be careful that effort is not necessarily negative. There are a lot of healthy efforts, both in physical and mental area. And I would say multilingualism is a very, very healthy effort.
Thank you. That's a very good note to end this keynote, and we will carry on in the discussion. We will leave Thomas with a cup of tea now, and I will just move on, if it is okay with everyone, with Priscilla. Are you there?
Yes.
Would you mind please turn on your directly your presentation, because
yes,
you're already co-host, so you can just go ahead and do it.
Okay. Will you stop recording now? Or
yeah, just stop.